The envoy was almost home. He had ridden from negotiations with King Amalric of Jerusalem, carrying the fragile weight of a possible understanding between two powers that should, by every simple version of history, have been enemies. He was under royal protection. His passage was supposed to be safe. Then the Templars found him. Before he could return to the mountain strongholds of the Syrian assassins, he was killed on the road. Not by a Muslim rival, not by a wandering bandit, but by knights sworn to defend the Christian kingdom whose king had just received him. So what had they destroyed? A secret alliance? Or the proof that no alliance could survive the politics of the Levant? To understand that question, we have to slow the story down. Because this was not a world of neat borders, clean loyalties, or enemies who stayed where later legends placed them. The road between Jerusalem and the mountains of Syria was not only a road through territory, it was a road through fear, money, faith, ambition, and suspicion. And somewhere along that road, diplomacy became a corpse. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. This is the story of two feared orders, the Templars and the Assassins, standing on the same violent frontier. It is a story often reshaped into fantasy, hidden brotherhoods, eternal wars, ancient secrets passed through coded bloodlines. But the older truth is stranger in a quieter way. Because in the Crusader Levant, survival could make enemies talk. Profit could make holy men hesitate. And one murdered envoy may reveal more about power than any legend ever did. Chapter 2. Two Orders, One Shadowed Frontier. If the murder on the road feels strange, it is because later memory has trained us to expect something simpler. Templars on one side, assassins on the other. White mantles against mountain daggers, cross against crescent. Even though the crescent itself belongs more to later symbols than to the complicated reality of the 12th century. It is a clean image, sharp enough for games, novels, and easy mythology. But the frontier did not work that way. The men who met, watched, threatened, bribed, and sometimes killed one another in Syria and Palestine were not living inside a legend. They were living inside a pressure system. Fortresses leaned over roads, pilgrims moved under guard. Farmers paid dues to whichever lord could actually protect them. Messages passed between rulers who publicly condemned one another and privately needed one another. A castle was not only a castle, it was a tax office, a warning sign, a shelter, a prison, a bargaining chip, and sometimes a loaded weapon aimed at the next valley. In that world, the Templars and the Syrian Nizari Ismailis became frightening for similar reasons, even though they were not the same kind of institution. The Templars had begun with an idea that sounded almost modest: armed protection for Christian pilgrims moving through dangerous country after the First Crusade. Yet modest ideas can become powerful when the danger is permanent. A small brotherhood of knights became a military order with vows, hierarchy, property, discipline, and an international network of support. They were monks who fought, but that phrase can mislead. It makes them sound like a contradiction, as if they were half one thing and half another. To their admirers, they were something more unsettling, men who had turned war into obedience, and obedience into a sacred profession. Their white mantles and red crosses mattered because they made violence visible as devotion. They did not fight as private adventurers, at least not in theory. They fought as an order under a rule, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But poverty for an individual knight did not mean poverty for the institution. Over time, the temple held land, castles, revenues, and privileges. It became one of the most capable frontier powers in the Latin East. That capability gave it prestige. It also gave it enemies. Across the same broken geography, the Syrian Nizaris occupied a different kind of precarious strength. They were a branch of Ismaili Shi'i Islam, a minority within a minority, surrounded not only by crusader states, but also by stronger Sunni powers that often regarded them with deep hostility. Their survival depended on mountain strongholds, careful diplomacy, intelligence, and the ability to make much larger enemies hesitate. They did not have the vast armies of a sultan. They did not hold a broad kingdom like Jerusalem. Their strength lay in select places, difficult terrain, loyal communities, and the reputation that a powerful man might not be safe simply because he was powerful. This is where myth begins to grow. A large army inspires fear in one way. A disciplined minority with hidden reach inspires fear in another. When a ruler fears an army, he counts troops. When he fears a secretive enemy, he imagines doors, servants, letters, knives, and the private room where armor is finally removed. The Syrian Nizaris understood the value of that fear. Their enemies helped them enlarge it. The word assassin would eventually become detached from its original setting and harden into a common word for murderer. That alone tells us how successful the legend became. But names are not neutral. They carry the fingerprints of the people who used them. Medieval crusaders and other hostile observers did not approach the Nizaris as careful ethnographers. They heard rumors, repeated insults, misunderstood religious divisions, and gave European audiences stories they were ready to believe. A small, embattled Shi'i community became, in Western imagination, a sinister brotherhood of drugged killers ruled by an almost supernatural master. That image is powerful. It is also too convenient. The Templars suffered a different transformation, but the process was related. Their discipline, wealth, secrecy, and independence made them useful in war and suspicious in memory. Because their internal life was closed to outsiders, outsiders filled the silence. Because they answered to a higher religious authority and possessed resources across borders, later generations could imagine them as anything: bankers, warriors, heretics, guardians of relics, victims of conspiracy, authors of conspiracy. The real Templars were already interesting enough. Legends simply found them more profitable when covered in codes and forbidden knowledge. There is a quiet irony here. The Templars and the Nizaris were turned into mirror images, partly because both were disciplined, feared, and difficult for outsiders to understand. Each had a structure that looked unusual to neighboring powers. Each cultivated loyalty. Each operated on a frontier where ordinary law often stopped at the range of a bowshot. Each could make kings uneasy. But they were not identical twins in different costumes. The Templars were a Latin Christian military order built into the machinery of crusading. The Syrian Nizaris were a religious political minority struggling to preserve autonomy among enemies who were often stronger. The Templars projected power through castles, cavalry, money, and institutional privilege. The Nizaris projected power through fortresses, selective violence, negotiation, and the careful management of reputation. To see them clearly, we have to resist the temptation to make one the shadow of the other. The frontier did not create fantasy enemies. It created practical men under extreme conditions. A Templar commander looking at a mountain fortress did not see a symbol in a modern myth. He saw a local power that could threaten roots, alter alliances, and disturb the balance of tribute and security. A Nizari leader looking toward the Crusader states did not see a single Christian civilization moving with one mind. He saw kings, counts, orders, ports, castles, rivalries, and possible openings. This is the first key to the murdered envoy. His journey only makes sense in a world where enemies could recognize usefulness in one another. Not affection, not secret brotherhood, usefulness. The kind that appears when two dangerous neighbors discover that a third danger may be worse. The kind that does not erase hatred, theology, or bloodshed, but sets them aside long enough for a messenger to ride under protection. And that is why the road home matters so much. The envoy was not crossing a simple line between Muslim and Christian. He was crossing a landscape where power was layered and unstable. Royal protection meant one thing. Templar interest might mean another. Local fear meant another still. In such a world, a safe conduct was not a magical shield. It was a political statement, and political statements can be challenged. Before we can understand why the Templars may have wanted that statement broken, we have to understand the land that made such contradictions normal. The Crusader Levant was not a chessboard with two colors. It was a crowded table, and almost everyone at it was armed. Chapter 3. The Levant was not a battlefield of two sides. The easiest mistake is to imagine the Crusader Levant as a long, clean line. Christian states facing Muslim states. Two civilizations pressing against each other like locked shields. It is an image with a certain force. It is also misleading. The Levant of the 12th century was not a single battlefield with two banners. It was a cramped political world where loyalties overlapped, rivalries cut across religion, and survival often made better sense than purity. A ruler might speak the language of holy war in public, negotiate with yesterday's enemy in private, and spend more time worrying about a neighboring ally than a distant foe. This does not mean faith was unimportant. It mattered intensely. It shaped law, identity, legitimacy, memory, and fear. But faith did not erase politics. It did not feed garrisons, pay knights, secure roads, or stop a rival prince from taking advantage of weakness. The people who lived there did not have the luxury of acting like characters in a moral painting. They had borders to hold, harvests to protect, prisoners to ransom, and enemies who sometimes shared their religion. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem itself was not a machine with one will. It had a king, but kingship in the Crusader states depended on negotiation with nobles, towns, bishops, military orders, and powerful families whose interests did not always match the crown. A royal decision could look firm from a distance and still be fragile on the ground. A king could grant protection, make promises, or open diplomacy, but he could not always make every armed Christian in the kingdom feel bound by his judgment. That point matters more than it first appears. When King Amalric dealt with the representatives of Rashid al-Din Sinan, he was not speaking from inside a perfectly obedient state. He was speaking from a kingdom where authority was real but contested, where the crown mattered, but so did the armed religious orders, where a political opening could be read by some as strategy and by others as betrayal. The Templars did not exist as decorative knights waiting for royal instruction. The Hospitallers did not either. These military orders had castles, lands, revenues, and their own international identities. They were part of the Crusader project, but not simply servants of any one ruler in Jerusalem. They answered to religious authority beyond the local crown, and they had responsibilities that stretched across the Latin East. Their commanders could look at a diplomatic arrangement and ask a hard question: does this strengthen the kingdom or weaken our position? That was not necessarily a noble question. It was not necessarily a corrupt one either. It was the kind of question that frontier powers ask when they have outlived several crises and expect several more. On the Muslim side, the picture was no simpler. There was no single Muslim world acting with one mind against the Franks. Sunni rulers competed with one another. Local dynasties guarded their own interests. Cities could be cautious, ambitious, rebellious, or exhausted. Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul, Egypt, and smaller lordships did not always move together. Sometimes their leaders fought the Crusaders. Sometimes they fought each other. Sometimes they made truces that scandalized people far away and relieved the people nearby. Shi'i communities added another layer to this complexity. The Syrian Nizaris, who later European writers would fold into the image of the assassins, were not merely a strange sect hiding in mountains. They were a vulnerable political religious community surrounded by more numerous and often hostile forces. Their position demanded a style of survival that could not depend on battlefield strength alone. They needed fortresses, information, fear, negotiation, and the careful use of limited violence. To call this world divided between Christian and Muslim is like describing a storm by saying, "There is water in the air." True, but not enough. The real map was made of relationships. A castle might threaten a road. A road might decide the life of a town. A town might pay taxes to a lord who needed coin to hire soldiers. A prisoner taken in one raid might become leverage in another negotiation. A marriage alliance could matter as much as a skirmish. A tribute payment could be humiliating, practical, or both, depending on who was telling the story. Even language could shift, depending on the audience. A chronicler writing for Latin Christians might describe Muslim powers as enemies of the faith, and sincerely believe it. The same political world might still contain truces, exchanges, trade, shared anxieties, and occasional cooperation. A Muslim historian could condemn the Franks and still record Muslim divisions with equal bitterness. Nobody needed to be hypocritical for this to happen. They only needed to live in a world where danger came from more than one direction. This is where many modern retellings lose the thread. They assume that contact between enemies must mean secret sympathy, hidden doctrine, or some grand concealed plan. But contact was not rare in the Levant. It was part of the operating system. Diplomacy did not require trust. It required need. A ruler could negotiate with someone he considered religiously wrong, politically dangerous, and morally suspect, because the alternative might be worse. That is not a contradiction. It is statecraft under pressure, and pressure was everywhere. The Crusader states were geographically narrow and demographically vulnerable. Their survival depended on fortifications, maritime links, reinforcements from the west, local accommodations, and the ability to exploit divisions among their neighbors. When Muslim powers were divided, the Latin states had room to maneuver. When larger forces began to consolidate, that room narrowed. For the Nizaris, the danger was even more intimate. They were not trying to conquer the Levant. They were trying not to be swallowed by it. A major Sunni ruler who could bring Syria into order might be a terrifying prospect. Disorder, for all its dangers, gave small powers room to breathe. A divided region allowed a mountain community to bargain. A unified enemy could turn bargaining into siege. Seen this way, an approach between Amalric and Sinon becomes less fantastical. It does not require us to imagine Templars and assassins exchanging sacred secrets in hidden chambers. It only requires us to understand that both sides could recognize a mutual problem. The Latin king had reason to worry about the strengthening of hostile Muslim power. The Nizari leader had reason to worry about the same thing from a different angle. Their interests did not have to be identical. They only had to touch. This is also why the reported Templar reaction, if the account is trusted, becomes so politically charged. The killing of an envoy under royal protection was not just violence. Violence was common enough. It was a statement about who had the right to decide the kingdom's policy. It suggested that the road itself could be contested, not only by enemies outside the kingdom, but by powers within it. And that is the darker shape of the story. The murdered envoy did not die because the Levant was divided into two simple camps. He died because it was not. He died in a world where Christian knights might fear a Christian king's diplomacy, where Muslim minorities might seek room through talks with Franks, where tribute could matter as much as theology, and where local power could interrupt royal design with a blade. The old frontier was not clean. It was crowded, practical, anxious, and deeply human. People there believed in God, honor, law, and sacred duty. They also counted money, measured distance, feared rivals, and made compromises they might later prefer not to explain. That is what makes the road home so revealing. It was not the edge between two worlds. It was the seam where too many worlds had been stitched together badly. Chapter 4. The Nizaris behind the word assassin. Among the many peoples stitched into the politics of Syria, few were described with less patience than the Nizari Ismailis. To their enemies, they were not simply rivals. They were a problem that seemed to refuse every ordinary solution. They were too small to be treated like a great empire, too resilient to be dismissed as a local nuisance, too disciplined to be explained as bandits, and too secretive for outsiders to describe calmly. So hostile language began doing what hostile language often does. It made the enemy smaller, darker, stranger, and easier to hate. The Syrian Nizaris belonged to the wider Ismaili branch of Shi'i Islam. Their story had roots far beyond the castles of Syria, in disputes over rightful leadership, sacred authority, and the line of imams. But for the rulers of the 12th century Levant, the theological details were often less important than the political fact. Here was a community that did not fit neatly under Sunni rule, did not disappear when pressured, and could not always be defeated by marching an army toward it. They held fortified places in the Syrian mountains, most famously associated with Masyaf. And from these positions, they learned to survive in a world where nearly every neighbor was stronger. They could not count on numbers. They could not rely on open-field battles. They did not possess the broad territorial depth of a kingdom. Their strength came from cohesion, terrain, local knowledge, and a willingness to use fear as a defensive wall. That last point is uncomfortable, but important. Assassination was real. Selective political killing was one of the tools associated with Nizari strategy. Important enemies could be struck in ways that seemed to pass through the armor of status. A ruler surrounded by guards might still wonder whether one of those guards had been bought, converted, threatened, or replaced. A commander might survive a battle and still fear the quiet approach of a man who had no intention of surviving afterward. But this is not the same as the legend. The legend is louder. It says the assassins were drugged into obedience with hashish, carried into artificial gardens, shown a counterfeit paradise, and then sent out to kill in the belief that death would return them to pleasure. It is a story with all the ingredients medieval and later audiences loved: intoxication, secrecy, sensual temptation, fanatical obedience, and an Eastern master manipulating young men like pieces on a board. It is also exactly the kind of story enemies tell when they want a disciplined opponent to appear irrational. The word assassin is usually connected to hostile terms related to hashish, though the history of the word is not as neat as the legend pretends. What matters for the story is how an insult hardened into an identity. Opponents used language that suggested degradation, criminality, and intoxication. European writers heard and reshaped these labels. Over time, the term moved away from a specific community in a specific political setting and became a general word for a murderer who kills by surprise. That migration of meaning did great damage to memory. Once assassin became a label detached from history, it became easy to forget that the Syrian Nazares were not merely a professional guild of killers. They were a community with beliefs, leaders, villages, fortresses, anxieties, and political calculations. They had children, farmers, envoys, religious teachers, and local obligations. They had to negotiate food, safety, loyalty, and survival. The knife, though memorable, was not the whole society. This is one of the great traps in studying feared minorities. The acts that make them visible to enemies are often the acts that least describe daily life. A chronicler remembers the murder of a prince. He does not linger over the ordinary maintenance of a mountain settlement. A rival ruler remembers the terror of a threat. He does not carefully explain the internal theology of the people he once condemned. A traveling storyteller remembers the rumor because rumor travels lighter than administration. The Nizaris, then, entered Latin Christian imagination through a narrow door. They appeared in stories when something alarming happened. A killing, a threat, a diplomatic exchange, a strange rumor from the mountains. The result was a portrait made mostly of edges. Sharp edges, frightening edges, but edges all the same. To understand Rashid al-Din Sinan's world, we have to put the center back into the picture. The Syrian Nizaris were not the strongest power in the Levant. That is precisely why they mattered. Strong empires can afford blunt instruments. Smaller powers often survive through intelligence, timing, and ambiguity. They make themselves difficult to absorb. They convince enemies that victory would cost more than it is worth. They turn reputation into a fortress beyond stone. Fear, in this sense, was not merely a byproduct of Nizari policy. It was part of the policy. If a powerful ruler believed that an attack on Nizari strongholds might one day be answered inside his own palace, he might pause. That pause could be worth more than 1,000 soldiers the Nizaris did not have. This does not make them innocent. It makes them political. That distinction matters because later myth often strips political actors of motive. It turns them into symbols. The Templars become secret guardians of forbidden truth. The assassins become faceless devotees of murder. Once that happens, the human world vanishes. We stop asking what pressures they faced, what choices were available, what risks they calculated, and what they hoped to prevent. The envoy sent to Amalric belongs to that more human world. He was not a messenger from a fantasy cult stepping out of a hidden paradise. He was a representative of a threatened community, testing whether negotiation with a Latin king could serve Nizari survival. That does not mean the mission was friendly in any sentimental sense. Diplomacy can be cold, cautious, even cynical, but it still requires recognition. To send an envoy is to admit that the other side has agency. To receive him is to admit that talking might achieve something killing cannot. This is why the later legends, for all their color, can obscure the most interesting part of the story. A drugged killer is easy to understand because he does not need politics. He acts because a master commands him. A mountain sect of monsters is easy to place outside normal history. But a small Ismaili power maneuvering between crusaders, Sunni rulers, local enemies, tribute arrangements, and shifting alliances is far more revealing. It shows us a Levant where identity was powerful, but not simple, where violence and negotiation were not opposites, where the people most demonized by their enemies were often the people their enemies still had to bargain with. The word assassin survived because it was useful. It gave fear a name. It gave outsiders an explanation that required no sympathy and little understanding. It made selective political violence seem like the expression of a strange essence rather than one harsh instrument among many. But behind the word was a community that had learned, under pressure, to make itself impossible to ignore. And when one of its envoys rode under royal protection toward home, he carried more than a message. He carried the possibility that the label could be set aside, at least for a moment, and replaced by calculation. That may be why his journey was so dangerous, not because he represented ancient evil, but because he represented a practical future that certain men could not afford to let arrive. Chapter 5. The Templars as soldiers, monks, and power brokers. The Templars are easy to recognize and difficult to understand. The image arrives before the institution does. A white mantle, a red cross, a mounted knight moving through the hard light of the eastern Mediterranean. It is so strong that it almost becomes a disguise. We see the warrior and miss the structure behind him. We imagine a charge across a battlefield and forget the account books, the storehouses, the castles, the legal privileges, the guarded roads, the chapters where decisions were made, and the quiet confidence of an order that did not belong entirely to any one king. That last point is essential. The Templars were not simply brave men with swords. Many warriors were brave. The Levant did not lack for courage. What made the temple unusual was discipline joined to independence. It was a religious order built for war, but also an international institution with its own hierarchy, its own estates, its own stream of donations, and its own memory of service. Its members took vows that sounded monastic. Poverty, chastity, obedience. They were expected to live under rule, pray under rule, eat under rule, fight under rule. In a violent world, that kind of orderliness had enormous power. A secular knight might fight for land, honor, ransom, lordship, family ambition, or private reputation. A Templar knight was meant to fight as part of something larger than himself. That did not make him less political. It made his politics more complicated. The order began with the protection of pilgrims, a mission that sounds almost pastoral until one imagines the roads themselves. A pilgrim was not walking through a painted map. He was moving through ravines, exposed tracks, contested crossings, and settlements where authority could shift faster than rumor. To guard a road in the Crusader East was not a minor service. Roads were arteries. Whoever secured them shaped trade, pilgrimage, military movement, taxation, and fear. From that mission, the Templars expanded. They defended strongholds, garrisoned towns, took part in campaigns, and became one of the most dependable military forces available to the Latin states. Their value came not only from their skill in battle, but from their permanence. Crusading armies from Europe could arrive with noise and devotion, then leave when vows were fulfilled or money ran out. Local barons might be powerful, but their strength was tied to inheritance, family politics, and regional interests. The Templars remained. The order had continuity, and continuity is one of the most underrated forms of power. A castle held by the temple was more than a defensive position. It was a statement that a professional religious military institution had planted itself in the landscape. The walls guarded roads and borders, yes, but they also guarded the order's interests. A Templar castle could become a point of leverage in negotiations, a place of storage, a symbol of commitment, and a practical reminder that the king's authority was only one layer of power in the kingdom. This is where the romantic picture begins to crack. The Templars were vowed to poverty, yet the order became wealthy. There is no contradiction if we distinguish between the individual and the institution. A brother might own nothing personally. The temple could own a great deal. Land, donations, rents, privileges, transport networks, and secure facilities made the order useful far beyond the battlefield. It could store and move valuables. It could handle money for pilgrims and rulers. It could survive between campaigns because it was not only a band of fighters, it was an organization. And organizations have instincts. They protect their revenue. They defend their reputation. They resist arrangements that may weaken their position. They remember injuries. They watch rivals. They interpret diplomacy through the cold lens of consequence. A king may see a negotiation as a path toward security. A military order may see the same negotiation as a threat to its influence, its income, or its control of a dangerous frontier. This does not mean every Templar decision was cynical. That would be too simple. And history is rarely improved by replacing one caricature with another. Many Templars were sincere religious men by the standards of their world. They endured danger, discipline, hardship, and often death. Their courage was not imaginary. Their faith was not necessarily a costume. The problem is that sincere belief does not prevent institutional self-interest. Often, it strengthens it, because men become most immovable when they believe their advantage is also a duty. A Templar commander could oppose a king and still believe he was defending Christendom. He could protect a tribute arrangement and believe he was protecting frontier stability. He could reject diplomacy with a feared Muslim minority and tell himself that compromise had crossed into danger. He could also, more plainly, fear the loss of money or control. These motives do not need to cancel one another. In real politics, they often travel together. The Templars' independence was sharpened by their place within Latin Christendom. They were supported by powerful religious and secular patrons, and they possessed privileges that set them partly outside ordinary local structures. They were not free from all pressure, of course. No institution in the Levant could ignore kings, nobles, bishops, towns, or military necessity. But the order had room to maneuver. It could act with a confidence that a lesser group would not dare. That confidence made the Templars valuable. It also made them dangerous. For a king like Amalric, the military orders were indispensable. A ruler of Jerusalem needed experienced fighters, fortified positions, and institutions that could hold territory under constant threat. But dependence is never comfortable. The crown needed the temple, yet the temple did not exist merely as an arm of the crown. When interests aligned, the arrangement could look like unity. When interests diverged, the fault line appeared. The killing of the Nizari envoy belongs on that fault line. If the story is accepted in its broad form, the action was not just the act of violent knights lashing out at an enemy. It was an intervention in royal diplomacy. The envoy had reportedly come under the protection of the king. His safe conduct represented more than courtesy. It represented Amalric's authority to open a channel of negotiation. For Templars to destroy that channel was to make a brutal claim. Some policies, even royal ones, could be stopped on the road. That is why the incident feels so modern in its logic. Not modern in its setting, but in its tension between state policy and semi-independent armed power. The king may sign the agreement, but who controls the men with weapons at the checkpoint? The ruler may imagine strategy, but who profits from the current disorder? The diplomat may carry words, but words are fragile when someone else controls the road home. The Templars were not fantasy villains standing in opposition to history's innocent possibilities. They were one of the hard facts of the Crusader Levant. Without men like them, the Latin states may not have survived as long as they did. With men like them, royal policy could become more difficult, more militarized, and more vulnerable to interests that were not fully royal. This is the uncomfortable balance. The temple gave the kingdom strength and limited the king's freedom. It guarded roads and could make roads unsafe. It embodied Christian discipline and could act in ways that embarrassed Christian authority. It was born to protect pilgrims, but in the political world it helped create. Protection itself became power. So when we return to the murdered envoy, we should not picture a random attack by men who simply hated the assassins. Hatred may have been present. Fear may have been present. Religious suspicion almost certainly colored the air. But behind the blade stood an institution with something to lose. And institutions, unlike legends, rarely kill for mystery alone. They kill when a living man carries a future they find unacceptable. Chapter 6. Rashid al-Din Sinan, the Old Man of the Mountain. Rashid al-Din Sinan enters the story through a fog of fear. To Crusader writers, he became the Old Man of the Mountain, a title that sounds as if it belongs to a folktale. Remote, watchful, half human and half legend, commanding death from a high place. The phrase has survived because it is memorable. It turns a political leader into an atmosphere. It places him above ordinary history, somewhere among cliffs, messengers, and rumors carried down through narrow passes. But Sinan was not powerful because he was mythical. He became mythical because he was powerful in a way his enemies found difficult to explain. He was the dominant leader of the Syrian Nizaris in the later 12th century, and under him their mountain communities became a force that both Crusader and Muslim rulers had to consider carefully. He did not rule a great empire. He did not command the armies of Nur al-Din or later Saladin. He did not possess the manpower of a kingdom. His power was narrower, sharper, and more unsettling. He governed a community whose survival depended on seeing danger before it arrived. That may be the first thing to understand about Sinan. His world punished carelessness. The Syrian Nizaris were surrounded by stronger neighbors. To the west lay Crusader territories and Latin fortresses. Around and beyond them stood Muslim powers, many of them Sunni, often hostile to Ismaili communities, and far better equipped for conventional war. A weaker leader in Sinan's position might have tried to hide and hope history passed him by. Sinan appears to have understood that hiding was not enough. A small power does not survive by being invisible. It survives by becoming too costly to destroy. This is where assassination fits into the story, but it should not swallow the story. Selective killing was one weapon in the Nizari arsenal. It could remove enemies, terrify rivals, and turn a leader's private security into a permanent anxiety. But assassination alone cannot explain decades of survival. A knife can kill a man. It cannot maintain fortresses, manage loyalties, negotiate truces, read the balance between competing rulers, or decide when not to strike. Sinan's reputation rests on violence, but his achievement rests on restraint as well. That may sound strange at first. The legend gives us a master of killers, a man whose followers supposedly moved wherever he pointed. But the historical Sinan is more interesting if we imagine him not as a madman unleashing chaos, but as a strategist rationing danger. If every enemy is killed, every neighbor becomes desperate. If every threat is answered with blood, eventually all sides may agree that the Nizaris must be crushed. Fear must be managed. It has to be strong enough to deter attack, but not so uncontrolled that it invites annihilation. For a minority power, reputation is a kind of currency. Spend too little and nobody respects it. Spend too much and it collapses into panic. Sinan seems to have understood that balance better than most of his enemies wanted to admit. His mountain strongholds gave him depth, but not invulnerability. Fortresses could resist, but they could also be isolated. Communities could be loyal, but loyalty had to be fed, defended, and justified. Religious authority mattered, but religion did not remove hunger, siege, or betrayal. The leader of such a world had to think in layers: spiritual legitimacy, local discipline, external diplomacy, and the careful selection of enemies. The Crusaders feared him, but they were not the only ones. Muslim rulers also had reason to watch Sinan. The Nizaris were not aligned naturally with the dominant Sunni powers. Their very existence challenged the religious and political order those rulers wished to impose. To a strong Sunni leader hoping to consolidate Syria, Nizari independence was more than a local nuisance. It was a pocket of resistance, a reminder that the mountains had their own loyalties, their own interpretation of authority, and their own means of retaliation. This helps explain why Sinan could look toward the Franks without that act being as bizarre as it first appears. He did not need to love the Crusaders. He did not need to admire their faith. He did not need to imagine a permanent brotherhood with men who, in other circumstances, might have gladly attacked him. He only needed to recognize that political survival sometimes depends on choosing which enemy is most dangerous at a particular moment. The rising strength of Sunni powers, especially as the age moved toward the dominance of figures like Saladin, changed the calculations of everyone in the region. For the Latin kingdom, a consolidated Muslim power threatened the fragile existence of the Crusader states. For the Nizaris, it threatened autonomy. That overlap did not create friendship. It created possibility. And possibility is often what fragile diplomacy is made of. Sinan's envoys, if we trust the broad outline of the account, approached King Amalric within this world of shared anxiety. What they carried may have been proposals, promises, gestures, or language later misunderstood by chroniclers. The details remain disputed, but the fact that such contact was plausible tells us something important. Sinan was not trapped inside the role his enemies wrote for him. He could negotiate. He could test openings. He could use diplomacy just as he used fear. This is precisely why he unsettled stronger rulers. A purely violent enemy can be answered with violence. A purely religious enemy can be condemned from a pulpit. A purely local enemy can be besieged or contained. Sinan was harder to categorize. He was a religious leader with political instincts, a mountain ruler with regional reach, a feared commander who understood the value of envoys. He could appear, depending on the observer, as heretic, prince, murderer, prophet, rebel, or necessary contact. That ambiguity gave him power. It also made him easy to mythologize. When a leader operates through secrecy, diplomacy, and carefully chosen violence, outsiders rarely see the whole design. They see fragments, a dead ruler here, a rumor there, a messenger received unexpectedly at a court, a threat whispered in the wrong place. The gaps between these fragments invite invention. Sinan's enemies filled those gaps with stories that made him seem monstrous. Later writers filled them with romance. But a monster cannot explain the envoy on the road. A monster sends killers because killing is all he knows. A strategist sends an envoy when he believes the political weather may be changing. That distinction changes the emotional center of the story. The murdered representative was not merely a servant of a feared sect. He was part of Sinan's broader method. Probe, bargain, pressure, survive. And perhaps that is what made him intolerable to the Templars. A Nizari threat could be met with vigilance. A Nizari raid could be answered with arms. A Nizari payment could be collected as part of the ugly arithmetic of the frontier. But a Nizari understanding with the king of Jerusalem was different. It suggested that Sinan might escape the box his enemies had built around him. It might alter tribute. It might reduce pressure. It might change who benefited from fear. The old man of the mountain was most dangerous not when he was imagined as a legend, but when he acted like a statesman. That is the quieter truth beneath the title. Sinan's strength did not come from being outside politics. It came from understanding politics in its most unforgiving form. He knew that a small community could live among giants only by making every giant uncertain. He knew that a road could carry a threat, a payment, or a proposal. He knew that survival was not a single act of courage, but a habit of calculation repeated year after year. And when his envoy rode back from Amalric's court, he was carrying one of those calculations home. He never reached it. Chapter 7. Tribute, Pressure, and the Price of Peace. Money has a way of making holy stories less comfortable. It does not erase belief. It does not make faith false. But it does remind us that even in a world saturated with sacred language, men still had to pay garrisons, repair walls, feed horses, reward loyalty, ransom prisoners, and keep roads open. The Levant was full of prayers, relics, sermons, and vows. It was also full of invoices. Some accounts tell us that the Syrian Ismailis paid tribute to the Templars. The details are not as solid as a tax ledger preserved under glass, and we should treat them with care. But the report itself is revealing because it fits the logic of the frontier. A smaller power, hemmed in by stronger neighbors, might pay to reduce pressure. A military order controlling dangerous roads and nearby strongholds might accept payment in exchange for restraint, protection, or simply the absence of trouble. Tribute could mean many things depending on who described it. To the payer, it might be a bitter necessity, a fee for breathing room. To the receiver, It might be proof of dominance. To a hostile observer, it might look like corruption. To a pragmatic one, it might look like frontier management. The same coin could be called peace, submission, extortion, prudence, or scandal. That ambiguity sits at the center of this story. If the Nizaris were paying the Templars, then the relationship between them was already more complicated than pure enmity. Not friendly, not equal, not secret brotherhood, but transactional. The kind of arrangement that appears when two armed powers do not trust each other, but understand the cost of constant violence. It was not romance. It was weatherproofing. The Templars, for their part, had reason to value such payments. A tribute stream was not only money in a chest, it was recognition. It told the surrounding world that the order could impose terms. It helped support the expensive work of holding the frontier. It tied the Nizaris into a pattern where the temple stood as a necessary force between danger and relief. And once an institution becomes necessary, it rarely welcomes being bypassed. This is where Amalric's diplomacy becomes dangerous. A direct understanding between the king of Jerusalem and Sinan could threaten more than abstract policy. It could change the practical balance on the ground. If the Nizaris reached terms with the king, what happened to tribute paid to the Templars? If the crown became the main broker of peace, what happened to the order's leverage? If Sinan no longer needed to pay, appease, or fear the temple in the same way, then a stream of money might dry up. But so might something even more valuable: the power to decide when pressure would be applied. That is why the envoy's journey cannot be understood only as a religious scandal. It may also have been a challenge to an existing arrangement. The king saw possibility. The Templars may have seen loss. Of course, we have to be careful here. The evidence does not allow us to enter the mind of every Templar involved. We cannot say with certainty that money alone drove the killing. History rarely gives motives so cleanly, and people rarely act from only one motive at a time. Religious hostility may have been real. Distrust of the Nizaris may have been intense. The order may have believed the king was being naive, or that negotiation with such a group endangered Christian interests. Some may have seen the envoy as a manipulator, not a diplomat. But the reported tribute adds a colder possibility. It suggests that the temple had material reasons to fear peace. This is the uncomfortable part. Peace is not always profitable for everyone. A dangerous border can produce its own economy. Fortresses need funding because the frontier is dangerous. The frontier remains dangerous partly because the men who manage it gain authority from that danger. Protection can become a service. Pressure can become a business model. And when a king tries to resolve a threat through diplomacy, those who have benefited from managing the threat may feel undermined. There is no need to turn the Templars into cartoon villains to see the problem. In fact, the problem is more interesting if we do not. They may have believed sincerely that they were defending the Christian East. They may also have wished to preserve tribute. They may have feared Sinan's influence, resented Amalric's initiative, and distrusted any arrangement that made a feared Ismaili leader a royal partner rather than a subordinate payer. These motives could sit together in the same room without embarrassment. Human beings are very good at discovering that their interests and their principles agree. For the Nizaris, the calculation was just as hard. Paying tribute may have bought time, but it also advertised vulnerability. It acknowledged that the Templars could hurt them. An agreement with Amalric might loosen that pressure. It might raise Sinan's status. It might turn a humiliating payment into a broader political bargain. Instead of dealing with a military order at the edge of conflict, the Nizaris could deal with a king. That shift would matter. A military order could be relentless, local, and institutionally stubborn. A king could be ambitious, but also strategic. Amalric had to think in terms of Egypt, Syria, alliances, rivals, and the survival of his kingdom. He might accept an arrangement that a frontier order disliked because he was looking at a wider map. Sinan, too, may have been looking at the wider map. Between them lay a narrow opening, not trust, but mutual usefulness. The price of that opening was uncertainty. No one could be sure how far Amalric would go. No one could be sure what Sinan truly offered. No one could be sure whether the Nizaris would remain useful partners or become dangerous once pressure was lifted. The Templars, if they felt threatened, may have interpreted uncertainty itself as danger. And in a world of armed men, danger often produced action before explanation. This is one of the most revealing features of frontier politics. Peace was not a soft condition. It was a weapon, a bargain, and sometimes a threat. To make peace with one group could weaken another. To remove tribute could remove income. To protect an envoy could announce a new hierarchy of authority. The road home was therefore not neutral ground. It was the place where a possible future crossed through the territory of those who preferred the present arrangement. The murdered envoy carried no army. He carried no castle in his hands. But he may have carried the end of a payment, the end of a pressure system, or the beginning of a royal policy that made the Templars less central. That made him dangerous in a way a soldier was not. A soldier can be defeated. A diplomat can rearrange the board. And somewhere on that road, before the message could return to Sinan, men who understood the value of pressure decided that the price of peace was too high. Chapter 8. Amalric's dangerous opening. King Amalric's court was not the place where simple dreams went to survive. It was a court built under pressure, inside a kingdom that had learned to think several moves ahead or risk being erased from the map. Jerusalem in the 12th century was sacred, yes, but it was also administrative, diplomatic, nervous, and intensely practical. Its king could not govern by piety alone. He had to weigh castles against treaties, crusading vows against empty treasuries, Egyptian campaigns against Syrian threats, and the pride of great orders against the needs of the crown. So when envoys from Rashid al-Din Sinan entered Amalric's diplomatic world, the meeting should not be imagined as a sudden outbreak of tolerance or as a hidden ritual between ancient brotherhoods. It was something more fragile and more believable, an opening created by danger. Amalric knew the Latin East could not survive by pretending every Muslim power was the same. The Crusader states had long depended on division among their neighbors. When Damascus, Aleppo, Egypt, and other powers were divided by rivalry, the Kingdom of Jerusalem could maneuver. It could strike here, negotiate there, delay one enemy by exploiting another. But when larger rulers began to gather strength across the region, the old room for movement narrowed. Nur al-Din had already shown what consolidation could mean. His power in Syria placed serious pressure on the Crusader states. Then came the rising force of Saladin, whose career would eventually alter the entire balance of the Eastern Mediterranean. From Amalric's perspective, the danger was not simply that Muslim armies existed. They had always existed. The greater danger was coordination, the possibility that fractured powers might become a single strategic threat. That is the background against which Sinan's approach becomes understandable. The Syrian Nizaris were not natural allies of the Franks. They were not waiting in the mountains for a Latin king to rescue them. They had their own religious identity, their own leadership, their own enemies, and their own survival strategy. But they also had reason to fear the strengthening of Sunni rule in Syria. A powerful Sunni ruler who could impose order across the region might see the Nizari strongholds not as useful neighbors, but as intolerable pockets of defiance. For Amalric and Sinan, then, the same shadow fell from different directions. That did not make them friends. It made them attentive. There is a difference, and it matters. Friendship belongs to stories people tell after trust has had time to grow. Attention belongs to politics. It is the moment when one ruler looks across the border and realizes that an enemy's enemy is not necessarily a friend, but may still be useful. In the Levant, that realization could be worth more than a speech about purity. The reported negotiations in the early 1170s seem to have touched precisely this dangerous possibility. Sinan's representatives came to Amalric. Amalric received them. Some accounts later suggest that the envoys offered something extraordinary, perhaps even conversion or submission. That claim is difficult and will need to be handled with care. For now, what matters is the more solid political shape of the encounter. A channel opened between the king of Jerusalem and the leader of the Syrian Nizaris. A channel is not an alliance. It is not a treaty carved in marble. It is not proof of secret affection. It is only a path along which messages can move. But in this case, even the path was dangerous. If Amalric could reach an understanding with Sinan, he might gain a useful counterweight against larger Muslim powers. He might reduce threats along certain routes. He might encourage division among his enemies. He might show that the king, not the military orders, controlled high diplomacy. Even a limited arrangement could strengthen the crown's hand. For Sinan, the benefits were just as clear. A direct understanding with the king could reduce pressure from the Franks. It might weaken or bypass the tribute relationship with the Templars. It could give the Nizaris more room to maneuver against Sunni rivals. It might even transform their position from isolated mountain sect to recognized political actor in the eyes of Jerusalem. Recognition is not sentimental. It can be a shield. A small power surrounded by larger enemies needs others to acknowledge that it cannot simply be ignored. Once Amalric received Sinan's envoys, the Nizaris were no longer only a frightening rumor in the hills. They were participants in diplomacy. That alone could disturb those who preferred them contained, demonized, and financially useful. The Templars would have understood the stakes. They were not naive men stumbling through a world of symbols. They knew roads, payments, threats, and pressure. They knew that a king's promise could alter the value of a frontier arrangement. They knew that diplomacy could cost an institution money and influence without a single castle changing hands. If the Nizaris no longer needed to pay tribute in the same way, if Amalric became their principal negotiator, if Sinan found protection through the crown rather than fear of the temple, then the order's position might be weakened. This is why Amalric's opening was dangerous not only to enemies outside Jerusalem, but to powers within it. A king's diplomacy can be most threatening when it succeeds. Failure leaves the old structure intact. Success rearranges responsibilities. It tells everyone who must now be consulted, who can be bypassed, and who has lost the privilege of controlling danger. The court may have seen opportunity. The Templars may have seen a breach. And between those perceptions stood the envoy. We should resist the temptation to make Amalric too modern in our imagination. He was not a secular strategist in a world without faith. He was a Christian king of Jerusalem, ruling a kingdom formed by crusade and sustained by religious meaning. But he was also a ruler in the Levant, and the Levant punished rulers who mistook slogans for policy. Amalric's diplomacy with Sinan did not require him to abandon his faith. It required him to recognize that the survival of his kingdom depended on more than battlefield zeal. That is what makes the episode so revealing. The most dramatic part is the murder, but the most important part may be the conversation before it. Somewhere in that exchange, two powers who had many reasons to distrust each other found enough overlapping interest to speak. The language may have been cautious. The promises may have been exaggerated later. The terms may never have been fully settled. But the opening existed strongly enough, at least in the account that survives, for its destruction to cause outrage. This was not the collapse of a grand secret alliance. It was the interruption of a possibility. And possibilities can frighten established powers more than enemies do. An enemy confirms the world as it is. A possibility suggests the world might be governed differently. Amalric's dangerous opening lay in that suggestion. He appeared willing to treat the Syrian Nizaris not merely as monsters in the mountains, not merely as payers of tribute, not merely as targets of suspicion, but as a political force that could be used in the larger struggle for the region. In doing so, he stepped beyond the simpler boundaries that later legend would draw. The envoy rode away carrying that step with him. He carried the king's protection, Sinan's calculation, and the faint outline of a future in which the Templars might not control the terms of fear. Whether the proposal was bold, desperate, exaggerated, or misunderstood, it had become real enough to threaten someone. And in the Levant, that was often enough. Chapter 9. The ambush that broke the possibility. The road should have been protected by the king's word. That is what makes the killing so sharp in the record. Envoys were not ordinary travelers. They moved through dangerous country carrying the dignity, the arrogance, and sometimes the fragile mercy of rulers. A safe conduct did not make the road physically safe, of course. It did not stop every robber, every feud, every sudden act of violence, but it created a political boundary. To harm such a messenger was not merely to kill a man. It was to insult the authority that had received him. The Nizari envoy had come from Sinan's world into Amalric's. He had spoken, or at least delivered the terms of those who sent him. Then he turned back toward the mountains, toward the communities that had waited for news of what might now be possible. He never reached them. According to the account that gives this episode its power, Templars intercepted him before he could return safely. The details of the ambush are not preserved with the fullness a modern investigator would want. We do not have a neat deposition, a physical map of the attack, or the voice of the envoy himself. What remains is starker, a representative of the Syrian Nizaris, traveling after royal negotiations, was killed by men of the temple. The simplicity of that sentence hides the political explosion inside it. If the envoy had been killed by Muslim rivals, Amalric might have called it treachery from outside. If bandits had killed him, the story could have become one more grim example of frontier disorder. But Templars were not outsiders to the kingdom of Jerusalem. They were among its most visible defenders. Their identity rested on service to the Christian cause, discipline under sacred vows, and protection of the vulnerable on dangerous routes. Yet here, if the story is true in its essential shape, they had turned a protected road into a place of royal embarrassment. Amalric's reaction, as reported, was not mild. He is said to have been outraged. That response matters. It suggests the killing was not understood at court as some routine act against a dangerous enemy. It was seen as a violation of the king's diplomacy. The murdered envoy represented a channel Amalric had opened, and the Templars had closed it with blood. That does not mean every person in the kingdom agreed with Amalric. Some may have believed the king had gone too far by receiving Sinan's representatives. Some may have distrusted any promise made by the Nizaris. Others may have seen the killing as brutal but useful. The frontier was full of people who could justify harsh actions by pointing to harsher dangers. But the reported royal anger tells us that the central issue was not only the life of one man. It was the question of command. Who had the right to decide policy? A king could negotiate, but could he compel the military orders to accept his negotiation? A royal safe conduct could be granted, but could it hold against men who believed their own interests, or their own interpretation of Christian defense stood above the king's judgment? The ambush forced those questions into the open. This is where the episode becomes more than a strange anecdote about Templars and assassins. It becomes a window into the architecture of power in the Latin East. The kingdom of Jerusalem was not weak in the sense of being imaginary. Amalric was not a puppet, but no ruler there could behave as if authority flowed in one clean line from crown to countryside. Power was distributed among nobles, churchmen, orders, cities, castles, and foreign supporters. The Templars were especially difficult because they were both inside and outside the kingdom's political body. They fought for the Christian East, held land within it, and shaped its defense. But they were not simply royal officers. Their action against the envoy, therefore, carried a message even if no formal message was written. It said that the temple could interrupt a royal opening when that opening threatened its view of the frontier. It said that a king's plan could be made meaningless if armed men decided the messenger should not survive. It said that diplomacy, for all its seals and words, still had to pass through territory where other powers kept watch. There is a brutal elegance in that. A negotiation takes time. It requires reception, language, interpretation, guarded courtesy, and the discipline to imagine a future not yet accepted by everyone. An ambush takes minutes. It needs only location, will, and the decision that consequences are tolerable. In that imbalance, we can feel the fragility of Amalric's project. The envoy may have carried a proposal that was exaggerated later. He may have carried terms that neither side fully trusted. He may have carried the seed of an alliance, or merely the first cautious gesture toward one. But killing him solved, for the moment, a very practical problem. It prevented the conversation from becoming harder to undo. That is often how sabotage works. It does not need to disprove an idea. It only needs to prevent the idea from gathering witnesses, documents, habits, and beneficiaries. A failed diplomatic experiment can be dismissed as fantasy. A successful one becomes policy. The Templars, if they acted from fear of Amalric's arrangement, did not need to defeat Sinan in the mountains. They only needed to stop the road from carrying peace back to him. Still, the killing was not cost-free. It placed the order in open tension with the king. It exposed the possibility that the defenders of Jerusalem might damage Jerusalem's own strategic choices. It also gave later writers a scene almost too charged to resist. Christian knights killing an envoy from the dreaded assassins, not during war, but after negotiation, not in defense of the king's command, but apparently against it. No wonder the story survived. It contains a contradiction that will not settle down. The Templars were sworn to Christian service, yet may have sabotaged a Christian king. The Nizaris were feared as killers, yet in this moment their representative appears as the victim of unlawful violence. Amalric, ruler of a crusader kingdom, emerges not as a simple zealot, but as a politician willing to explore practical contact with a Muslim minority. Every role is disturbed. That disturbance is the real historical value of the ambush. It forces us to abandon the easy moral arrangement. The assassin is not the assassin in the scene. The holy warrior is not clearly the guardian of order. The king is not merely a crusading figurehead. The road is not a border between civilizations, but a corridor where competing claims of authority collide. And perhaps this is why the murder feels larger than the body left behind. One man died, but the victim was also a possibility. The possibility that Amalric and Sinan could test a pragmatic understanding, that tribute arrangements might be changed, that the politics of the Levant could briefly bend away from inherited hostility. The killing did not prove such an alliance was real. It proved only that some believed the possibility was dangerous enough to stop. That is not a small thing. Men do not usually risk a king's anger to destroy fantasies. They risk it to destroy threats. The envoy's death left Amalric facing a grim truth about his own kingdom. His diplomacy could reach into the mountains, but it could not safely cross the road home. His authority could receive an enemy's messenger, but not guarantee that all Christian swords would respect the protection he gave. And in the distance, Sinan would have learned his own lesson. A king's promise was valuable, but it traveled through a world where the king was not the only power. The ambush broke more than a mission. It revealed the hidden fracture beneath the Latin East, where royal strategy, military order, frontier profit, and religious suspicion could all pull in different directions at once. The murdered envoy did not simply expose hostility between Templars and Nizaris. He exposed the instability inside the side that had promised him safety. That is why the road remains the center of the mystery. Not because we can recover every footprint in the dust. We cannot. But because the event shows us the exact point where diplomacy met the hard edge of institutional power and lost. Chapter 10. William of Tyre and the Problem of the Source. At the center of this story stands a man who was not on the road when the envoy died. William of Tyre did not leave us a blood-stained report from the ambush site. He did not preserve the envoy's own words. He did not give us the private thoughts of the Templar commander who ordered, allowed, or justified the killing. What he left was something more complicated. A courtly history written by a highly educated churchman, deeply involved in the kingdom whose crisis he described. That makes him valuable. It also makes him dangerous. William was not a distant monk copying rumors from the edge of the map. He belonged to the Latin East's political world. He knew courts, rulers, churchmen, rivalries, negotiations, and the anxieties of a kingdom that had to explain itself to both local subjects and Western Christendom. He wrote close enough to power that his account cannot be dismissed as tavern gossip. But he also wrote close enough to power that we have to ask what power looked like from his chair. This is the problem with good sources. Bad sources are easy to mistrust. Good ones require more discipline. William's account matters because without him, the episode of Sinan's envoy and the Templar ambush would be far dimmer. He gives the story shape. The approach from the Syrian Nizaris, the negotiations with Amalric, the issue of tribute, the royal protection, the killing, and the outrage that followed. His narrative is the backbone on which much later discussion hangs. But a backbone is not the whole body. William was close to the Jerusalem court, and that closeness colors the scene. Amalric appears as the ruler pursuing a bold and useful policy. The Templars appear as men who obstruct it. The king's diplomacy looks strategic. The order's action looks arrogant, perhaps even criminal. That may be exactly what happened. It may also be how a royal insider understood an episode in which the crown's authority had been humiliated. A chronicler does not need to lie in order to shape meaning. He chooses where to begin. He chooses which motives to emphasize. He chooses what to leave vague. He knows which readers will nod when certain institutions are criticized. He writes with assumptions that may be invisible to him and very visible to us. This does not make him useless. It makes him human. And William had reasons to distrust Templar independence. The military orders occupied an uneasy place in the kingdom. They were defenders of the Latin East, but they were also privileged institutions that could resist local control. To a churchman and royal servant concerned with order, hierarchy, and the survival of the kingdom, Templar self-confidence could look less like courage and more like dangerous pride. If the order interfered with royal policy, William would not have needed much encouragement to see the act as part of a larger pattern. That possibility does not erase the ambush. It reframes our reading of it. The killing may well have happened. Amalric's anger may well have been real. The envoy may indeed have represented a diplomatic opening that the Templars found intolerable. But when William presents the affair, we are seeing it through the eyes of a man for whom the central scandal was not only murder, it was disobedience. It was the spectacle of a military order behaving as though it could overrule the king. That is a political interpretation, and it may be right. Still, we should notice what we do not have. We do not have a surviving Templar explanation that can be weighed equally against William's account. We do not have the Nizari version. We do not know exactly what the envoy said at court, how formal the proposals were, or how far Amalric believed the arrangement could go. We do not know whether the Templars acted from financial anxiety, religious hostility, strategic suspicion, personal rivalry, local command decisions, or some mixture of all of these. The silence around the story is not empty. It is part of the evidence. When one voice dominates a scene, the historian's work is not to reject it automatically, but to listen for its pressure. William tells us that something shocking happened. He also tells us, by the way he frames it, what kind of shock mattered to him. A king had been wronged. A useful possibility had been damaged. The Templars had behaved with intolerable independence. For a documentary story, this is where temptation appears. It would be easy to say, William exposed the truth. It would be just as easy to say, William invented a smear against the Templars. Both statements are too neat. The more honest reading sits in the middle, where history often keeps its most interesting material. William may preserve a real crisis while also arranging it in a way that serves a courtly view of authority. He may be accurate about the event and partial in his interpretation of it. That distinction matters because the central mystery depends on degrees, not absolutes. If William is broadly reliable, then the Templars did sabotage Amalric's diplomacy with Sinan's envoy. That would mean the hidden alliance, or at least the possibility of one, was real enough to be attacked. If William exaggerated the depth of the negotiations, then the story becomes less about a near alliance and more about court anger transformed into dramatic narrative. If he misunderstood Nizari intentions, then the supposed opening may have looked more Christian, more formal, or more promising to Latin observers than it truly was. In every case, the story remains revealing. Even if the proposal was thinner than William believed, the reaction tells us the contact mattered. Even if the Templars had reasons William did not fairly record, their intervention still points to the unstable relationship between crown and order. Even if the Nizaris were not offering what Amalric hoped, their use of diplomacy still shows that they were political actors, not merely figures from hostile legend. The source problem, then, does not ruin the story. It deepens it. William of Tyre gives us a window, but not a mirror. Through him we can see the outlines of fear, negotiation, anger, and institutional rivalry. We cannot see everything clearly. The glass is tinted by court politics, ecclesiastical concerns, and the writer's own judgments. But without that window, the murdered envoy might have vanished almost entirely from memory. So we read William carefully, neither kneeling before him nor pushing him aside. He is not a neutral camera. No medieval chronicler was. He is a witness shaped by position, loyalty, frustration, and intelligence. He reminds us that history is not only made by those who act, but by those who decide how actions will be remembered. And because William remembered this killing as a scandal, the road home remained open in another sense, not for the envoy, not for Amalric's diplomacy, but for the question that still troubles the story: whether a real political possibility was destroyed, or whether a court historian turned a broken negotiation into the symbol of everything he feared about Templar power. Chapter 11. Alliance, Conversion, or Misunderstanding. The most astonishing version of the story claims that Sinan's envoys came to Amalric with something far larger than a political arrangement. They came, according to this tradition, with an offer that sounded almost impossible: that the Syrian Nizaris might accept baptism, abandon tribute to the Templars, and enter some deeper relationship with the Franks. It is the kind of claim that immediately changes the temperature of the room. A military understanding is one thing. A practical alliance against a common enemy is unusual but believable. Frontier rulers did that sort of thing when circumstances pressed hard enough. But conversion, the idea that the feared assassins of Syria might become Christians under the protection of the King of Jerusalem, belongs to a different category. It feels too dramatic, too useful, too perfectly shaped to embarrass the Templars after the envoy's death. And that is exactly why we have to handle it with care. The claim may preserve something real. It may also preserve how Latin observers wished to understand what was being offered. Medieval diplomacy did not always move in the clean vocabulary modern historians would prefer. Words like obedience, peace, submission, protection, tribute, and conversion could be heard differently by different souls. A gesture that one party understood as political recognition might be described by another as spiritual movement. A promise to stop paying one power and deal with another might become, in the telling, a sign of religious transformation. This is not because medieval people were foolish. It is because diplomacy is often performed in language designed to leave space. Sinan's representatives may have spoken in ways that flattered Amalric's authority. They may have hinted at openness. They may have promised loyalty, or peace, or withdrawal from tribute arrangements. They may have framed their approach in terms that Latin Christians interpreted through their own hopes. The court of Jerusalem, hearing that a feared Muslim minority wanted royal protection, may have imagined the opening in the most triumphant possible form. A king does not merely receive proposals, he interprets them, and interpretation is never innocent. For Amalric, The suggestion that the Nizaris might come under his influence, whether politically, financially, or spiritually, would have been extremely useful. It would elevate his diplomacy from mere bargaining to something that could be presented as a Christian success. It might show that royal strategy could achieve what force had not: the drawing of a feared enemy away from hostility and toward the orbit of Jerusalem. For critics of the Templars, the conversion claim made the ambush look even worse. If the envoy had only been negotiating a local arrangement, the Templars had disrupted policy. But if he had been carrying the possibility of conversion, then the Templars had not merely opposed the king. They had prevented souls from entering the Christian fold. They had allowed institutional interest, suspicion, or greed to interfere with a sacred opportunity. That accusation had teeth. It turned political disobedience into spiritual scandal. But the very usefulness of the claim makes it suspicious. History often preserves the version of an event that best serves the storyteller's moral architecture. A murdered envoy is tragic. A murdered envoy carrying news of possible conversion is explosive. It casts Amalric as visionary, the Nizaris as almost redeemable, and the Templars as men who destroyed both policy and salvation. The shape is powerful enough that we should not accept it too easily. What can be said with more confidence is narrower, but still important. There was contact. There was negotiation. There were reported discussions about tribute and the relationship between Sinan's people, the king, and the Templars. There was enough significance in the exchange for the envoy's killing to become a major grievance in the surviving account. Beyond that, the evidence becomes thinner. The conversion question sits in that thinness. It may have been genuine. We cannot fully rule it out. Religious identity in the medieval world was deeply held, but political pressure could create surprising openings, especially for vulnerable communities seeking protection. Groups sometimes used the language of conversion, submission, or religious alignment as part of diplomatic negotiation. Leaders under threat might explore extreme options if the alternative was destruction. But there is another possibility: misunderstanding. Not a simple misunderstanding, like mishearing a word across a noisy room, but a structured misunderstanding shaped by need. The Nizaris may have offered peace. The Franks may have heard submission. The Nizaris may have sought relief from Templar tribute. The court may have heard a movement toward royal and perhaps Christian obedience. The Nizaris may have used deliberately flexible language, allowing Amalric to believe more than they were ready to concede. Diplomacy often works that way until someone forces clarity. The envoy's death prevented clarity. Because he was killed before the arrangement could mature, the proposal remained suspended between versions. It never had to become a treaty with terms. It never had to survive implementation. It never had to reveal whether conversion was serious, symbolic, exaggerated, or invented in retrospect. A dead messenger leaves behind an unfinished sentence, and unfinished sentences are where legends grow. This is why the question should not be reduced to whether the Nizaris really intended to convert. That is important, but it is not the only issue. The deeper question is what different people needed the proposal to mean. Amalric may have needed it to mean opportunity. The Templars may have needed it to mean danger. William of Tyre may have needed it to mean a scandal that proved the dangers of Templar arrogance. Sinan may have needed it to mean room to maneuver. Later readers, hungry for secret alliances and hidden brotherhoods, would need it to mean something more mysterious still. But the 12th century reality was probably colder. The Syrian Nizaris were under pressure. The Latin kingdom was anxious about the changing balance of power. The Templars had material and strategic interests tied to the existing order of tribute and fear. In that setting, a proposal did not have to be pure to be serious. It only had to be useful. Conversion, if it was mentioned, may have been less a sudden spiritual awakening than a diplomatic instrument, a word that opened doors, softened hostility, or tested how far Amalric was willing to go. That does not make it meaningless. Medieval rulers took such language seriously, but it does mean we should be careful before imagining the mountain communities of Sinan preparing, as one body, to abandon their faith because a Latin king offered protection. The human world is rarely so tidy. Communities do not change identity like a cloak at sunset. Leaders can negotiate, but followers must accept. Religious authority cannot be rearranged without consequence. A Nizari move toward Christianity would have shaken the foundations of Sinan's own legitimacy. It would have altered internal loyalties, external enemies, and the meaning of the community itself. Such a transformation would have required more than an embassy and a promise. That is why the most plausible reading is not a finished conversion plan, but a dangerous ambiguity. The envoys may have brought terms that Latin Christians understood, or chose to understand, as pointing toward conversion. The Nizaris may have been seeking political protection, while allowing their hosts to imagine spiritual victory. Amalric may have seen a rare chance to weaken enemies and strengthen his crown. The Templars may have seen a threat wrapped in pious language. No single version completely satisfies the evidence, and perhaps that is why the story survived with such force. It sits at the border between fact and desire. It shows how diplomacy can become propaganda before the ink is dry. It shows how a practical negotiation can be remembered as a near miracle, a betrayal, or a lost alliance depending on who tells it. The murdered envoy did not merely carry a message from Sinan. He carried an ambiguity, and in the politics of the Levant, ambiguity could be more dangerous than a declared enemy. Chapter 12. Saladin's shadow over the negotiations. To understand why Amalric and Sinan might have listened to one another, we have to let a larger shadow fall across the map. The murdered envoy is easy to isolate. A road, a royal promise, an ambush, a scandal. The scene is sharp enough to stand alone, but in the Levant, very little stood alone for long. A small diplomatic gesture could be shaped by wars hundreds of miles away. A payment made in one valley could depend on the ambitions of a ruler in another city. Even a quiet embassy from the mountains could carry the weight of regional fear. That fear had a name that would soon dominate the age: Saladin. At the time of Amalric's dealings with Sinan's representatives, Saladin was not yet the almost legendary figure he would become in later memory. He had not yet taken Jerusalem. He had not yet become the polished symbol of chivalric opposition that both Muslim and Christian writers would later shape in different ways. But his rise was already part of a broader transformation. The old divisions that had helped the Crusader states survive were beginning to look less dependable. Before Saladin, Nur al-Din had already made the Franks understand the danger of coordination. He was not merely another local ruler to be watched and bargained with. He represented a more disciplined Sunni power in Syria, one capable of turning fragmentation into pressure. For Jerusalem, that mattered deeply. The Latin kingdom had survived not because it was stronger than every neighbor, but because its neighbors were rarely united for long. Division was not a footnote to Crusader survival. It was one of its foundations. A divided Muslim political world gave the Franks options. They could exploit rivalries, make truces, raid selectively, negotiate with one power against another, and avoid facing the full weight of the region at once. But if Syria, Egypt, and other major centers began to move under a shared strategic purpose, the Crusader states would face something far more dangerous than border warfare. They would face scale. Scale is the enemy of small frontier kingdoms. Jerusalem could be bold. It could be well fortified. It could call on the military orders. It could receive help from the West. But it remained geographically exposed and politically delicate. Its strength depended on careful timing, maritime support, internal cooperation, and the failure of its enemies to combine their advantages. A ruler like Amalric could not ignore signs that this balance was changing. Sinan could not ignore them either. For the Syrian Nizaris, a stronger Sunni order in the region was not an abstract strategic problem. It was an existential one. Their communities were Ismaili Shi'i, religiously distinct and politically vulnerable. They lived in fortified pockets precisely because the surrounding world could be hostile. A powerful Sunni ruler who wished to impose unity across Syria might see the Nizaris as an irritant to be negotiated with temporarily, or as a heretical obstacle to be crushed when convenient. That is the point often missed in romantic versions of this story. The possible contact between Amalric and Sinan was not born from secret spiritual kinship. It was born from pressure applied by a third force. The Franks and the Nizaris did not have to share a worldview. They did not have to trust one another. They did not have to forget past violence. They only had to recognize that consolidation under a stronger Sunni power could harm them both. In that recognition, a narrow channel could open. This is the kind of alliance that later storytellers often find unsatisfying because it lacks purity. It is not noble friendship. It is not hidden brotherhood. It is not the meeting of two enlightened orders beyond the prejudices of their age. It is colder, more limited, and more credible. Two vulnerable powers, each dangerous in its own way, measuring whether temporary cooperation might delay a larger threat. There is something almost mathematical about it. If the Nizaris remained isolated, they risked pressure from Sunni rulers and tribute demands from the Templars. If Amalric ignored them, he left a potential lever unused. If the Templars maintained the old arrangement, they preserved income and influence, but perhaps at the cost of a broader royal strategy. Every party was calculating from a different position on the same board. Saladin's rise made that board less forgiving. Later memory tends to turn Saladin into a character of destiny, as if everyone in the early 1170s already knew exactly what he would become. They did not. People in the moment rarely understand the full shape of the age they are living through, but they can feel pressure. They can notice patterns. They can see when old divisions are closing. Amalric did not need prophecy to understand that a stronger power linking Egypt and Syria would place Jerusalem in grave danger. Sinan did not need prophecy to understand that a consolidated Sunni authority could leave his mountain communities with fewer openings. The envoy's mission belongs to that sense of narrowing possibility. When a small political world starts to lose room, its rulers try strange doors. They speak to people they once condemned. They accept messengers they might once have dismissed. They test language that can be denied later if it fails. Diplomacy becomes exploratory, almost subterranean. It moves not because trust has appeared, but because fear has become disciplined enough to seek options. That may be the most important way to read Amalric's dangerous opening. It was not a sign that the Crusader king had suddenly become indifferent to religious boundaries. It was a sign that he understood boundaries did not defend themselves. The survival of Jerusalem required him to think beyond slogans. A feared Ismaili leader in the mountains could be a threat, but he could also be a counterweight. In a region tilting toward larger confrontation, even a limited counterweight mattered. Sinan's position was equally pragmatic. Cooperation with Amalric, if that is what he sought, would not have erased Nizari identity. It might have protected it. To deal with the Franks was risky, but so was remaining alone. A ruler surrounded by enemies does not ask whether every option is clean. He asks which option leaves his people alive next season. That is a hard truth, but it is a useful one. The Levant did not reward moral simplicity. It rewarded adaptation, not always nobly, not always successfully, but consistently. Those who could not adapt became dependent on miracle, reinforcement, or luck. Those who could adapt still faced ruin, but at least they had a hand on the wheel. The tragedy of the murdered envoy is that adaptation may have been stopped before it could be tested. Had the negotiations continued, they might have collapsed on their own. Amalric and Sinan may have discovered that their interests touched only briefly. The conversion language, if it was ever seriously raised, may have proved impossible. The Templars might still have resisted. Saladin's rise might have overtaken every local calculation. Nothing guarantees that the opening would have changed the fate of the Crusader states or saved the Nizaris from later dangers. But history is not made only by what succeeds. Failed possibilities reveal the anxieties of the people who feared them. The killing of the envoy suggests that somebody understood the stakes. A road was closed because the message traveling along it might have altered the balance between king, order, and mountain power at precisely the moment when the regional balance was already shifting. Saladin's shadow does not solve the mystery. It changes its scale. The question is no longer simply whether Templars hated assassins, or whether Amalric was bold, or whether Sinan was sincere. The deeper question is how a fragile political world reacts when a stronger future begins to form around it. Some rulers negotiate, some orders resist, some envoys ride with promises that are not yet solid enough to protect them. And sometimes, before the larger war arrives, the smaller betrayal comes first. Chapter 13. From Failed Diplomacy to Later Bloodshed. The envoy's death did not end the relationship between the Franks and the Syrian Nizaris. It changed the atmosphere around it. A broken negotiation does not vanish cleanly. It leaves behind suspicion, insult, and the memory of what might have been possible. In the Levant, where every power watched every other power for weakness, a failed embassy could become more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It could become a grievance stored for later use, a story retold in private, a reason to distrust the next safe conduct, the next promise, the next smiling reception at court. For Sinan's people, the lesson must have been severe. A king of Jerusalem might speak, negotiate, and offer protection, but he did not fully control the armed world through which his promises traveled. The Templars could act. Local interests could intervene. Sacred vows did not guarantee diplomatic restraint. The Franks were not one thing. For Amalric's side, the lesson was no easier. The Nizaris were not merely enemies to be condemned from a distance. They could be contacted, perhaps bargained with, perhaps used against larger threats. But they were also a power with a long memory and a reputation for answering danger in ways that ignored the usual defenses of rank. This is the uneasy background to later bloodshed. The most famous later case came in 1192, when Conrad of Montferrat, newly chosen as king of Jerusalem, was assassinated in Tyre. The killing stunned the Latin East. Conrad was not a minor noble caught in some border skirmish. He was one of the most important Frankish figures of his generation, a man whose survival of siege and politics had made him central to the future of the kingdom after the catastrophe of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem. Then, at the moment when his position seemed to be rising, he was struck down. The killers were associated in the sources with the assassins, and the murder quickly became wrapped in accusation. Who had ordered it? Who benefited? Was it the work of Sinan's network acting from its own grievance? Was it connected to Conrad's dealings, debts, insults, or seizures? Was some rival among the Franks involved? Was a Muslim ruler behind it? Was the truth simpler or more tangled than anyone wanted to admit? The evidence does not give us a single clean answer. That uncertainty is important. Conrad's assassination became the kind of event into which every faction could pour its suspicions. In a fractured political world, a spectacular murder did not merely remove a man, it created a battlefield of explanations. To accuse someone of using the assassins was to accuse them of a hidden crime without necessarily proving it. The Nizari's reputation made them useful not only as killers, but as instruments of rumor. This is one of the darker consequences of fear. Once a group becomes famous for secret violence, every unexplained death near power begins to lean in its direction. The reputation that protects a small community can also trap it inside every story of intrigue. It becomes believable before it is proven. Conrad's death shows how far the world had moved from Amalric's attempted opening, and yet how much remained the same. The Franks still needed allies and suspected one another. Muslim rulers still maneuvered through war, truce, and diplomacy. The Nizaris still occupied that unsettling position between weakness and reach. They were not strong enough to dominate the region, but they were feared enough to alter its politics. A king could fall. A succession could shift. A carefully arranged future could be punctured by men approaching at the right moment. But we should not turn every Nizari action into revenge for the murdered envoy. That would be too neat and too cinematic in the wrong way. Nearly 2 decades separated Amalric's negotiations from Conrad's assassination. Amalric himself was gone. The Third Crusade had transformed the political landscape. Saladin had taken Jerusalem. Richard of England had arrived. And the Latin East was struggling to rebuild power along the coast rather than from the Holy City itself. The region had changed. Still, the earlier episode helps us read the later one. It shows that contact between Franks and Nizaris never belonged to a simple category. They were enemies, negotiators, tribute payers, feared neighbors, possible tools, and possible threats depending on the moment. The same group that might send an envoy in one decade could be accused of killing a Frankish ruler in another. The same crusader world that might receive Nizari diplomacy could later imagine Nizari hands behind political murder. That is not contradiction. It is continuity in a violent key. The Levant did not divide people permanently into alliance and enmity. It moved them along a spectrum. Today's threat could become tomorrow's messenger. Today's negotiation could become next year's accusation. A ruler could seek cooperation with one faction while condemning another. A military order could collect tribute from a feared enemy and then destroy a diplomatic channel with that same enemy. These are not clean categories. They are habits of survival in a region where no one could afford innocence for long. Conrad's assassination also reveals something about the limits of power. Great men in the Levant surrounded themselves with soldiers, titles, marriages, alliances, and claims. They built legitimacy like a wall. But legitimacy did not stop a determined killer. The Nizari method, when used, attacked not the army, but the assumption behind the army. That rank creates safety. That is why their violence terrified rulers so deeply. It was not only death, it was the message that power could be reached at its most personal point. And yet, even here, the myth must be kept in check. The assassins were not supernatural. They were not everywhere. They did not control every political death from behind a curtain. Their power was frightening because it was selective, not infinite. Later stories inflated them into a hidden hand moving history at will. The record suggests something more constrained and more plausible. A small, disciplined community using rare, memorable acts to survive among forces that could otherwise crush it. The difference matters. A secret master controlling kings belongs to fiction. A vulnerable mountain power weaponizing fear belongs to history. The first flatters our love of conspiracy. The second teaches us how political weakness can produce unconventional strength. After the envoy's murder, no stable hidden alliance emerged between the Templars and the Nizaris, or between the Nizaris and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. What emerged instead was a pattern of unstable contact. Payments, suspicion, occasional negotiation, sudden violence, and stories that grew sharper each time they were retold. The frontier did not become a brotherhood. It remained a frontier. And on that frontier, bloodshed rarely clarified anything. It often made the story harder to read. A corpse could prove hostility or hide a bargain. An assassination could be revenge, strategy, punishment, or someone else's plot wearing a familiar mask. The Nizari name could explain an event, or become the excuse that prevented anyone from looking further. That is why the murdered envoy and Conrad of Montferrat belong in the same long shadow, even if they are not pieces of one simple plan. Both show a world where diplomacy and violence were not opposites. They were neighboring tools. Both show how the Nizaris could move from negotiation to terror in the imagination of their enemies. Both show how Frankish politics remained vulnerable not only to outside attack, but to internal rivalry, ambition, and fear. The road home did not lead to alliance. It led into a longer history of accusation, calculation, and blood, where the question was never only who struck the blow, but who needed the blow to mean something. Chapter 14. The Myth of the Eternal Secret War. The strangest thing about the Templars and the Assassins is not that they became legends. It is that the legends made them easier to recognize and harder to see. Modern imagination loves symmetry. It likes two hidden orders, moving through history like rival shadows. One Christian, one Eastern, one armored, one silent, one guarding sacred secrets, the other striking from the dark. It is a powerful image because it feels designed. Too designed, perhaps. Real history is rarely so tidy. The past usually arrives with loose ends, missing papers, dull motives, unpaid debts, and people doing dangerous things for reasons that would disappoint a novelist. The Templars and the Nizaris did occupy the same violent frontier. They did fear, pressure, negotiate with, and sometimes harm one another. There were tribute arrangements, diplomatic openings, accusations, and killings. That is enough to make the story gripping without adding an eternal secret war. But later fiction often wants more than politics. It wants destiny. So the local world of the Levant is stretched into something grander. The Templars ceased to be a military order with castles, privileges, discipline, money, and institutional anxieties. They become guardians of hidden knowledge, architects of invisible power, or villains in a conspiracy that somehow survives every change of century and geography. The Nizaris ceased to be a threatened Ismaili community maneuvering among stronger powers. They become a timeless brotherhood of perfect killers, moving wherever history requires a blade. Both transformations are dramatic. Both flatten the people involved. The medieval record helped create this problem, though not always intentionally. Chroniclers wrote from fear, loyalty, theology, politics, and rumor. They were not modern reporters. They did not separate fact, interpretation, insult, and moral lesson with the neat labels we might prefer. A story about a Nizari killing could become a warning about heresy. A story about Templar independence could become a warning about pride. A political event could be shaped into a moral example before the ink dried. Rumor traveled especially well in the medieval world because it filled gaps faster than investigation could. If a ruler was murdered in a way that seemed intimate and impossible, people needed an explanation. The assassins provided one. If the Templars acted with unusual independence, people wondered what lay behind their closed chapters and guarded wealth. Secrecy, even ordinary institutional secrecy, invites invention. The less outsiders know, the more confidently they imagine. Then came later layers. European writing about the Islamic East often developed a taste for the exotic, the sensual, and the sinister. The old tales of drugged killers and false paradises were repeated and embroidered because they satisfied expectations. They made the East appear dangerous in a way that was both frightening and entertaining. The Nizaris were no longer treated primarily as participants in a specific 12th century political struggle. They became characters in a Western dream of hidden Eastern despotism. The Templars, too, were remade by later anxieties. Their downfall in the early 14th century, with accusations, trials, and confessions extracted under pressure, gave future generations a rich field for speculation. Once an order has been destroyed under clouds of scandal, almost any mystery can be attached to it. Treasure, heresy, secret doctrine, forbidden rites, lost relics. The more uncertain the evidence, the more confident the legend becomes. That is a useful rule in the history of myth. Uncertainty does not weaken a good legend. It feeds it. The supposed eternal war between Templars and assassins grows from this soil. It takes scattered contacts and conflicts and gives them a hidden master plot. It treats pragmatic frontier dealings as clues to ancient rivalry. Tribute becomes secret control. Diplomacy becomes coded alliance. Ambush becomes ritualized war. A murdered envoy becomes not a casualty of fragile politics, but proof of some vast underground struggle. The trouble is that this version removes the very thing that makes the real story meaningful. The real Templars did not need to be supernatural conspirators to matter. Their independence was already politically explosive. Their wealth, discipline, castles, and privileges gave them the ability to shape royal policy, guard roads, pressure enemies, and resist kings. That is power enough. The real Syrian Nizaris did not need false gardens and magical obedience to frighten rulers. Their survival strategy was already extraordinary. A small community, surrounded by stronger enemies, learned to use reputation, diplomacy, fortresses, and selective violence to make itself impossible to dismiss. That is also power enough. The myth of eternal secret war makes the past larger, but also less intelligent. It turns strategy into destiny and politics into costume. It lets us avoid the harder questions. Why would holy warriors protect a tribute stream? Why would a Christian king negotiate with a feared Ismaili leader? Why would a vulnerable Muslim minority speak with the Franks? Why would an order sworn to service sabotage its own king's safe conduct? Those questions are more disturbing than any fantasy because they do not depend on hidden magic. They depend on recognizable human motives: fear, profit, rivalry, ambition, survival, and the ability to justify almost anything when the frontier feels threatened. Modern entertainment did not invent the fascination, but it amplified it. It found in Templars and Assassins two names already loaded with atmosphere. Few audiences need long explanations before they understand the mood. Templar suggests armored secrecy. Assassin suggests silent death. Put them together, and a world appears instantly, even when that world owes more to later imagination than to the 12th century. There is nothing wrong with fiction knowing it is fiction. Legends have their own life. They reveal what later ages fear and desire. But trouble begins when the legend walks backward and replaces the people who actually lived. The Syrian Nizaris were not symbols waiting for modern stories. They were a community under pressure. The Templars were not merely masks for conspiracy. They were a hard, disciplined institution embedded in the defense and politics of the Latin East. Their encounters were not part of an endless hidden war stretching through time. They were products of a specific landscape, specific threats, and specific arrangements that could break under stress. The murdered envoy is important precisely because he resists the myth. He does not show us two ancient orders locked in perfect opposition. He shows us a messier truth: negotiation between enemies, conflict inside alliances, money beneath ideals, and violence used to stop diplomacy before it changed the balance of power. That is not less dramatic than legend. It is more unsettling because it feels possible. The eternal secret war is a beautiful machine. Every piece fits. Every action has hidden meaning. Every century becomes part of one design. History is not a machine like that. History is a road where a messenger can ride under protection and still be killed before reaching home. It is a king whose promise cannot command every sword. It is a mountain leader trying to survive among giants. It is an order guarding the frontier and guarding its own interests at the same time. The legend gives us shadows that last forever. The record gives us something darker: men making choices, then leaving later centuries to mistake those choices for destiny. Chapter 15. The truth behind the hidden alliance. So what was hidden here? Not a brotherhood, not a centuries-old pact between white-mantled knights and mountain emissaries, not a secret doctrine shared across faiths, not a carefully preserved alliance moving beneath the surface of crusade, jihad, court politics, and assassination. The evidence will not carry that weight. What it can carry is something smaller, sharper, and more historically believable: contact, negotiation, tribute, mutual pressure, and a brief possibility of pragmatic cooperation between people who did not need to like one another in order to find one another useful. That distinction matters because the word alliance can deceive us. It sounds firm. It suggests signed terms, shared aims, repeated coordination, and a future both sides expected to defend. But the world around Amalric and Sinon was not kind to firm arrangements. It produced openings, not certainties. It produced cautious approaches, not necessarily trust. A messenger might carry a proposal across a dangerous road, but that did not mean a durable partnership already existed behind him. The stronger conclusion is more limited. The Syrian Nizaris and the Latin Kingdom were aware of one another as political actors. The Nizaris appear to have paid tribute to the Templars, or at least were remembered as doing so. Amalric received representatives from Sinan's side. The negotiations were serious enough, in the surviving account, for the killing of the envoy to become a scandal. The Templars, if William of Tyre's narrative is broadly trusted, had reason to fear that the king's diplomacy might damage their own interests. That is not nothing. In fact, it is more revealing than the myth. A secret brotherhood is easy to imagine because it does not require us to understand the region. It floats above the map. But a fragile political possibility forces us to look directly at the machinery of the Levant. Tribute, royal authority, military orders, vulnerable minorities, Sunni consolidation, contested roads, and the price of protection. It asks us not to believe in hidden masters, but to examine visible pressures. The likely truth is that Amalric and Sinon found a narrow overlap of interests. Amalric needed ways to weaken or divide the larger Muslim powers threatening his kingdom. Sinan needed space to preserve Nizari autonomy among enemies stronger than his own communities. Both could look toward the rise of Sunni power in Syria and see danger. Both could see that a limited understanding might be useful. Neither side had to surrender its identity for that calculation to make sense. This was not idealism. It was not tolerance in the modern sense. It was not a sudden discovery that faith no longer mattered. It was the realism of people living too close to disaster. The Templars, meanwhile, may have seen the same opening as a threat. If the Nizaris reached terms with Amalric, the order's tribute relationship could be weakened. Its control over a dangerous frontier arrangement could be challenged. Its ability to define the Nizaris as a managed enemy might be reduced, and perhaps, just as importantly, the king's authority would expand into a space where the temple had grown used to acting with unusual freedom. That gives the murder its political meaning. The envoy's death did not destroy a fully formed alliance. It destroyed the conditions under which one might have been tested. It prevented ambiguity from becoming policy. It stopped a conversation before its true shape had to be revealed. And because the conversation was stopped, later centuries inherited a mystery instead of a treaty. That is why the story remains so easy to enlarge. Nothing exposes the imagination like an unfinished negotiation. Had Amalric and Sinon concluded clear terms, historians could argue over the clauses. Had the proposal openly failed, the episode might have faded into the ordinary dust of diplomacy. But a murdered envoy leaves behind a more suggestive silence. What exactly did he carry? What would Sinan have accepted? What did Amalric believe he had gained? What did the Templars fear enough to risk royal fury? The answers are partial. That partialness is not a weakness of the story. It is the story. The truth behind the so-called hidden alliance is not that later legend invented everything from nothing. It did not. There was enough real contact to inspire memory. There were enough political stakes to make the account credible in its broad outline. There was enough Templar-Nizari entanglement through tribute and pressure to make simple enemy categories useless. But the legend took a fragile moment and hardened it into a secret structure. It turned a possible arrangement into an ancient design. It turned local politics into timeless conspiracy. It took men reacting to immediate dangers and imagined them as servants of a hidden plan. The older truth is more human and less stable. Amalric was not opening a door into a secret world. He was trying to survive in the one he had. Sinan was not offering mystical brotherhood. He was maneuvering from a position of danger. The Templars were not merely villains from a shadow play. They were an institution defending power, income, doctrine, and judgment as they understood them. Everyone in the story was acting from pressure. That pressure is the real hidden force. It pressed the Nizaris toward negotiation with enemies. It pressed Amalric toward diplomatic experiments that might have scandalized simpler minds. It pressed the Templars toward violent intervention. It pressed William of Tyre to remember the affair as a warning about disobedient power. It pressed later storytellers to search for a grander pattern than politics alone could provide. But politics was enough. A mountain leader, a crusader king, and a military order did not need a shared secret to collide. They only needed competing interests on the same road. So when we ask whether there was an alliance, the most honest answer is this: there was probably an opening. There may have been a proposed understanding. There may have been terms that sounded, to Latin ears, like submission or even conversion. There was certainly enough contact for the episode to matter, but there is no solid evidence for a long-term hidden partnership between the Templars and the Nizaris, and no reason to imagine a stable underground brotherhood binding them across the decades. The alliance, if we use the word at all, was not a structure. It was a possibility. And possibilities are fragile things. They depend on timing, trust, language, roads, and the restraint of people who may profit from their failure. In this case, restraint failed. The envoy died. Amalric's opening collapsed. Sinan's calculation was interrupted. The Templars preserved, at least for the moment, the harsher logic of the frontier. The truth, then, is not that the legend is completely false. It is that the legend points in the wrong direction. The secret was never a hidden friendship between Templars and assassins. The secret was that the Levant made such contact possible at all. Chapter 16. What the Levant reveals in the dark. In the end, the murdered envoy tells us less about a secret alliance than about the world that made such an alliance imaginable. That world was not clean. It did not obey the categories later centuries preferred. The Crusader Levant was a place where belief mattered fiercely, but belief did not remove hunger, ambition, fear, money, or geography. A Christian king could negotiate with a feared Ismaili leader. A Muslim minority could seek room through contact with the Franks. A military order sworn to sacred service could act from profit, suspicion, and institutional self-defense. None of this means faith was false. It means human beings carried faith into politics, and politics changed the way faith moved. That is the deeper lesson of the road home. The envoy rode under royal protection, but royal protection was not enough. Amalric's word could open a diplomatic path, but it could not command every armed interest that stood along it. Sinan could send a representative into the kingdom of Jerusalem, but he could not guarantee that the kingdom was one kingdom in practice. The Templars could defend Christendom and still defend themselves. The old legends prefer a simpler shape. They give us eternal enemies, hidden masters, ancient codes, and wars fought in silence beneath ordinary history. But the real story is more troubling because it does not need fantasy. It only needs institutions with something to lose, rulers with too few options, and a frontier where every promise had to pass through someone else's zone of control. The hidden alliance was likely never more than a fragile political possibility. There was contact, there was negotiation, there were tribute arrangements and overlapping interests. There may even have been language bold enough for Latin writers to hear conversion or submission inside it. But there is no solid reason to imagine a lasting brotherhood between Templars and assassins. No secret structure binding them beyond the reach of ordinary power. What existed was thinner, and because it was thinner, it was easier to break. A messenger can carry a possibility, but he cannot make it real by himself. For that, he needs time. He needs return journeys. He needs terms repeated, tested, doubted, revised, and accepted by people who may not want them accepted. The envoy was killed before the conversation could harden into policy. His death left behind not an alliance, but a question shaped like one. Perhaps that is why the story survived. It shows us the Levant without its mask of simplicity. Enemies could bargain. Holy warriors could calculate. A feared sect could use diplomacy. A king of Jerusalem could act like a regional strategist. A military order could become powerful enough to challenge the policy of the crown it served, and survival could blur every line drawn by faith. The envoy's body disappears from the record almost as soon as it appears. We do not know his final thoughts. We do not know whether he believed his mission would succeed. We do not know whether he carried a promise, a proposal, or only the careful language of men who wanted more time. But we know what his death revealed. It revealed that the road between Jerusalem and the mountains was not merely a road through hostile territory. It was a road through competing authorities, private interests, sacred claims, and unfinished futures. It was the place where diplomacy and betrayal could ride so close together that one might overtake the other before sunset. That is the true secret in the dark. Not that Templars and assassins were secretly the same. Not that they served one hidden design. But that the people of the Levant lived in a world where even the fiercest enemies sometimes had reason to speak, and even the holiest warriors sometimes had reason to silence them. The murdered envoy never reached safety, but the question he carried did.